Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler episode 81. Today the Amateur Traveler goes to Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. 15-hour flight, oh, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. I have three news stories for you today. The first one is an unusual and inadvisable way to protest the long lines at airport security. There was a German tourist in the Philippines who thought that the security at the Manila airport was overzealous, and he performed an impromptu strip after being asked to go through the x-ray machine twice. He took off his pants and is facing 6 years in prison. In the second news story, incidents like the one yesterday where hundreds of passengers were stranded on a parked JetBlue Airways plane for 11 hours at JFK before they were unloaded have given rise to the cries for a passenger's Bill of Rights. And it looks like a bill stands a pretty good chance of making it into law in the United States House and Senate. And basically that bill says, among other things, that passengers would be notified within 10 minutes of a delay of known diversions, delays, and cancellations via airport overhead announcements or on aircraft announcements. It also provides that for ground-based delays of longer than 2 hours, food, water, sanitary facilities, access to medical attention, and other essential needs would be provided for. And also provides that passengers who are bumped or passengers who are delayed due to flight cancellations or postponements of over 12 hours would get a refund of 150% of the ticket price. I'll put a link at amateurtraveler.com to the details for that bill. And then last story, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is there's a hotel in London, the Hoxton Hotel, that offered this week 500 rooms for £1 and another 1,600 for only £29. The bad news is by the time I saw this story, it had expired. This is the kind of story that I would send out if I see it on time, both in the mailing list and probably also on the discussion boards. There is a place in the discussion boards for you to post deals that you see online. So check both of those out or sign up for the mailing list if you want to see these deals before they go away. I'd like to welcome back to the show Julie of the Washington Travelcast, who sent me an email a while back and asked if I'd be interested in Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. And being the history buff I am definitely interested in talking about them. Welcome back to the show, Julie.
Well, thank you.
When I say back to the show, I've got a lot of new listeners. If you have just started listening to the show recently, Julie came on to talk about Washington, D.C., and she does a podcast on Washington, D.C., the Washington Travelcast, right, and then has also been on the show talking about Berlin.
Yes.
So this one is back a little more close to home for you.
Yes.
You've been to Williamsburg recently, but I assume you've been there multiple times.
Yes, actually my in-laws live in Williamsburg, so we get there quite frequently. Although I have to say this is the first time I actually bought the ticket and went in the buildings.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, I'm not. I've walked around a lot, but I've never actually bought the ticket before.
Let's not assume that everybody knows what these three different locations, which are all closely grouped, where they are and what they are. So let's start with that.
Okay. There are three major historic sites, all within about, I think it's 15 miles of each other. Right now, the most notable one is Jamestown, and Jamestown is where the first permanent English settlement in the Americas settled. And then that was in 1607, in May of 1607, when Englishmen settled in Jamestown, Virginia. Then there is the colonial Williamsburg, which is really kind of the granddaddy of historic sites in this area. I believe there are 88 original colonial buildings, and they come from about the time of the American Revolution, so around the mid to late 18th century. And they've been very, very well preserved, and they really present a wonderful view of what that time was like. And the third one is Yorktown, which is the site of the last battle in America's War of Independence.
Is there any particular order we should cover these? There's a lot to say about each of them, obviously.
Well, I think...
Historically? Should we do them in chronological order? Okay.
Is the way, yeah.
All right, let's start with Jamestown then. I haven't been to Jamestown. I've been to Williamsburg a number of different times, but never been to Jamestown or Yorktown, actually.
The interesting thing about Jamestown is there are actually two sites. There is historic Jamestown, which is the National Park Service site, and that is actually where the colony was. It's out on kind of an island. There's a lot of nature trails and stuff, so you can see kind of what did that area look like when these settlers arrived in 1607. In fact, a couple of years ago, they actually filmed the film The New World down on that island, in right where all this happened. I happen to know that because I have a sister-in-law who was an extra in the movie. The other site is called Jamestown Settlement, and that is more of a private site. That is a recreation of what life was like there, and this is really cool because there is, for example, the Goodspeed ship has been recreated there, and in fact they sail it regularly as a tall ship, but you can actually go on to the Godspeed ship. There were three ships that brought, kind of like Columbus, these guys came with three ships too, and there was the Godspeed, the Susan Constant, and the one I can never remember, but there were three ships that arrived in 1607, and they have recreated them. They have recreated the settlement. They have recreated an Indian village of the time. time. And they also have an extensive historical museum. So it's really, really interesting site.
And you can tour the ship too, I assume, and get that claustrophobia of how could you possibly put this many people in this small boat.
Yes, although I did notice that they do have authentic 17th century steel safety stairs so that you won't kill yourself when you're going down into the hold. When we were there, it was kind of fun because they were having some kids help them furl the sails. So they were explaining how it was done, and they were talking about how the sails worked and letting the kids do all the work. So that was very interesting.
So they were learning the ropes.
Yes, absolutely.
And anything else stand out for Jamestown? This, as I recall, this wasn't necessarily the most idyllic place to put a colony. It was a little bit of swampland at the time.
It was a little swampy, but in that way it was not idyllic, but it certainly was much better climate-wise than the colony that was started about 15 years later up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Sure. Since I grew up in the Massachusetts area rather than in the Virginia area like my husband, I was making those comparisons. Clearly, the area was more lush, the gardens were fuller, and there were a lot of people died the first year, but not nearly as many as did further north.
Well, and that was actually quite the case in both colonies for a number of years. As people got off the boat, they would often die in the first year. Anything stand out about the second one, the historic recreation, as you go there and you see how the people lived? Very similar to what you'd expect, or some big surprises?
There were some interesting things. Of course, as you might expect, tobacco farming was very big, and we saw some of that. I was really impressed with how completely self-sufficient they were. We happened to be there Thanksgiving weekend, the last time we visited, and they had this food thing going on, and it was interesting how they butchered a pig and really talked about how they used every single bit of this animal. And they were talking about all the different foods and how they got them, and what they got from the Indians, what they used together in unusual ways, which was really very impressive. It was the way that the simple resourcefulness of these people. And of course, everyone, both there, and there are a few, not everyone, but there are a few people in historic Jamestown also who are in character and in costume, and that's always very exciting because you really feel like you're really kind of being surrounded by it.
Okay. Anything else to stand out about either the Jamestown?
One of the funny things was we looked at a map of the route of the colonists to Jamestown, and they actually came through the Caribbean, and I, from the life of me, cannot figure out why they didn't stop there. That's what I would have done.
Well, I think the Spanish were already fairly well established in a lot of that area, too, though. I think that was...
Yeah, but there was some, Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about Williamsburg, then. And Williamsburg is the larger of the three sites, or the four sites, I guess, actually, with the two Jamestowns.
Absolutely. The largest and actually the most expensive, which is actually what probably has delayed me actually buying the ticket. Williamsburg is really interesting because it was the capital of Virginia. It was where everything was happening around the time of the Revolution and immediately after the Revolution. And at one point, the strategic battle decision was made to move the capital of Virginia to Richmond because it was easier to defend. And when that happened, Williamsburg dried up. It just lost all of its industry, all of what made it go. And it was really a fairly impoverished place for a couple of centuries. And the reason this is important is because nobody built new houses, and therefore they didn't demolish the old ones. And when the area started picking up, when the whole Hampton Roads area started picking up with the coming of the naval base and such, late 19th, early 20th century, enough time had elapsed for the people to say, hey, look, we have something very special here, and to bring it back and all. So I found that interesting. It was a pattern that we have seen a lot in
Right,
in
that's
Europe,
exactly what I was
in
thinking.
places like Williamsburg and such.
I think of Bruges in Belgium, where the harbor silted up, and so the city was kind of captured in a little time capsule.
Yep.
So if you go to Williamsburg, and I'm not sure everyone knows about this too, you'll see some people in costume in Jamestown or in the recreation, not the historic park. But then in Williamsburg, you'll see all sorts of artisans and such plying their trade.
Everything. Yeah, it's almost a peopled city. There are so many volunteers there. You walk down the streets, and some of the houses have British flags in front of them because at the time that they are recreating Williamsburg, it's still a relatively loyal British colony. So there's a British flag out front, and you go in, and if it's a shop, there are 3 or 4 shopkeepers, and if it's a silver place, there is a silver worker, and he will explain to you, and they stay absolutely, for the most part, we had one exception to this, but they stay absolutely in character, and it's really interesting to talk to them.
And did you have a favorite of the different places that you went in Williamsburg?
Yeah, the Capitol building, which was the state Capitol building.
The State House.
The state of Virginia's Capitol building, and it was where the original bicameral legislature for Virginia, it still hails back to that time, originally sat. And we're talking about people in this legislature named Patrick Henry and George Washington and folks like that.
And for our listeners who are not Americans, Patrick Henry is the one who stood up in that legislature and said, "I know not what path others may choose, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death."
Liberty or give me death. Yes. And George Washington was the official first president of the United States because we ignore the ones under the Articles of Confederation.
I don't know. I think officially they would be, but under the Constitution, the first one, right?
Under the first Constitution, he was the first one, and many people think he may have been the best one. My husband likes to refer to him as the original George W. But anyway, the docent who led us through that was someone who clearly loved history and clearly had a passion for this, and really gave us an absolutely wonderful tour. And in fact, we have some of that tour on our podcast on Williamsburg, which was from back this last January, and you can listen to it.
Oh.
And we actually have this guy talking. He's very interesting.
Now, one thing we didn't say is when you would recommend to come.
Well, I will tell you that the weekend of the 11th through 13th of May, that entire area is going to be a zoo. And if you're thinking about going then, make your reservations now if you can still get a hotel. And there are zillions of hotels in Williamsburg, but they're all going to be filled because that's the actual 400th anniversary weekend. Almost any time is good, especially for Williamsburg. They have things going on that are seasonal. Over Christmas, they light the town the way that colonials would have decorated for Christmas, and that is supposed to be just beautiful. I have seen it from the outside, and it's very interesting from the outside, but I understand you can go in candlelight tours of the buildings and things like that, which is supposed to be really lovely. You get in the spring and summer, of course, a lot of kids, a lot of families. It's a great place to go with families. In addition to the historic sites, there are a number of fun family entertainments, theme parks, SeaWorld, things like that in the area, and the whole naval area in Norfolk and such like that. So there's really quite a lot for families in that area. So it's a great place to go in the summer.
Now, I think I would actually recommend against the heat of the summer in either Washington, D.C. or Williamsburg. I recall the first time I went there was, I believe we would go to a shop and then go sit in the shade and drink a lemonade and go sit in the shade and drink an orangeade and then go to a shop and go to watch somebody make musical instruments, which was one of my favorite things, and then go sit down and drink something that was quite warm, quite sticky.
Yeah, typically the climate in Williamsburg, Jamestown, Yorktown is more moderate than Washington, D.C. because it is closer to the water. And that helps a little. But you're right. August, particularly can be extremely sticky, a little less humid in Williamsburg than it is in Washington. I definitely discourage people coming to Washington in August, but the truth is that if you have kids and they're school age and the age that would most benefit from this, you don't have a lot of choices. Usually it's July or August. So I find it very hard to discourage people from coming in that time. Autumn in this area of the country is always wonderful. October is golden, so you cannot do wrong coming in October.
Did you get a chance to visit any of the taverns or the eating places in Williamsburg on this trip?
Not on this trip, but I've been to several of them before. One interesting thing about Williamsburg is that it's open, that you don't go through a gate to go in, and you can walk the streets and the outsides of the buildings, and you can go to the restaurants, and you can go to the shops, and a couple of the historic buildings without necessarily buying a ticket. The first time I went to Williamsburg was when one of my daughters was considering going to William and Mary, and their student hall is, of course, a historic building. It was the second college in the United States,
right,
and the first public college in the United States, and is still a very fine institution. So
and William and Mary predates Williamsburg by a few years, as I recall.
Yes, it does.
And Mary had died before Williamsburg was founded, as I recall, the difference in the names.
Mm-hmm. That's correct, actually. And Thomas Jefferson was an alumnus of William and Mary. Even though he's known for the University of Virginia, which he did essentially found and build, it was William and Mary that he went to.
Mm-hmm. I didn't recall it. It's been long enough since I've been to Williamsburg. I'd forgotten that you didn't have to purchase an admission to get into the grounds.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed our dinners there at Christina Campbell's Tavern, I believe is the one that
Yes, I've been there, yes.
And all of the menus are the type of food that would be available at the time, so a little different fare than you'd be used to, but good fare.
Very good, yes. And they have a variety. They have a fancier restaurant, the King's Arms, and Christina Campbell's, which is a more homey kind of tavern kind of restaurant. Mm-hmm. And they have a coffee shop. Very much like, I don't know if you know this, but in colonial America, coffee shops were very big. And they actually have one coffee shop they're doing an archaeological excavation of, but they've built a coffee shop kind of in one of the buildings across the way. Not all of the buildings at Colonial Williamsburg are original. 88 of them are original, but there are probably another 40 or so that are recreations, but they're recreations down to the stone.
88 is rather a lot, though, in this area.
88 is rather a lot, yes.
Anything else stand out for Williamsburg as part of the experience? When you go there, we're going to the shops, we're going to see the artisans making things, blacksmith, instrument music makers, silversmith. We're eating in the taverns. What else are we doing?
We're going to visit the homes. We're going to be able to go through the homes. We're going to visit the governor's palace, which is not an original building because it burned down. And if I remember correctly, that was one of the reasons that the capital never returned to Williamsburg, because they would have had to build new governor's palace. And actually, the colonial governors were very happy to be in this palace, but the new American governors really felt it was a little over the top. So, because they were trying very much to be Democrats. So they really felt this was a bit over the top. So there really wasn't a feel to go back and rebuild that. They wanted to move on. But that is a really interesting look at late colonial life and what would the royal governor, who, of course, came from England and at the end of his governorship went back to England, and the political tensions between this guy who comes and stays for 2 years and rules us all, and the folks here whose livelihood is here in this area and who are becoming more and more connected to this land that is America.
Interesting. Yeah. Anything else stand out about Williamsburg?
I could go on for 3 hours about Williamsburg. And in fact, I think we may have. Anyway, no, actually, we only went on for 1 hour about Williamsburg. But
you finally got to Williamsburg, you said last time, at least in terms of going inside. Any surprises?
The biggest surprise, I think, was there's a church there. It's not part of the official buildings, but you can go in it. It's still a living Episcopal church, and of course it's the church that George Washington and Patrick Henry and Thomas Nelson, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and all kinds of people went to, which was not a surprise, but what was a surprise was how much information I was able to get out of that church just sitting there, just reading. They have plaques on the pews about the life there, and this is an Episcopal church. It is a historic building, but it's not a part of the historic site, and I was surprised at how meaningful that was to me and how much I learned. It also was really, really a surprise how you could get into not just the dry facts of history, but how was this affecting people? What were they caring about? There is a play that goes on through the day, and if you come early in the morning and you follow around, you can go and you can actually walk all the way through this play, which ends in a climax of General Washington coming into town and giving a little bit of a speech, talking about the troops that are encamped right there on essentially their village green, which nobody is particularly happy about. But, you hear the women worried about being able to get decent cloth from England, and you hear people complaining about merchants taking wares and hiding them so that they don't have to necessarily give them to the army, and all these very human things that I think really bring the history of it to life, much more than just the tours and just the facts.
Interesting. You're mentioning the church. Now, of course, this would have been an Anglican church at the time before the split between the two countries. And at this time, you would have rented a pew. So do they have marked, it looked like, whose pew was whose?
Yes, you can find out which one was George Washington's pew.
Okay.
I've been at least 5 churches where George Washington rented a pew. This is a man who went to church a lot.
I actually happened to live in the rectory at one time of the first Episcopal Free Church in America, which happened to be in Troy, New York, where I went to school. So that's one of the things that I became aware of, that it wasn't until almost mid-1800s actually it was even late 1800s that you didn't have to rent a pew in the Episcopal Church.
There is a church in Jamestown, actually, that was built. It is, I think, the 3rd church on the site. And one of the important things about it was that one of the donors, the donor who paid for the construction of the church, did it with the idea that anyone could come. And that was very unusual, of course, for these Anglican churches. But she felt it was a scandal that people had to pay for a pew if people couldn't come to church if they couldn't, and so she made sure that they could.
Yeah, I think in general the visitors' pews would be in the back.
Yeah.
So the people who had rented the pew would have a place up front where people could see you. I don't know. My church tends to feel from the back to the front. I think we would have to charge more for the back, but
Mine too.
Let's talk about Yorktown.
Yes, Yorktown, again, like Jamestown, is 2 sites. One is the Yorktown National Battlefield, which is a National Park Service site. It's kind of the same dichotomy as we have in Jamestown, where we have one that's the actual site and one that's trying to recreate the experience. But the national site still has the earthworks that were built during the Revolutionary War, during that battle. And you walk out on them and talk about the battle strategy and all that. You can drive around on a driving tour and see all the different sites associated with the supply lines and all kinds of things. And in addition, you get to actually go to Surrender Field, which after the battle was the field that they made the agreement that the British would be allowed to surrender at this field.
And just again, for those of you who are not familiar with the history, we talk about it being a battle. It's really actually more of a siege, where Cornwallis gets penned up against the ocean here, and the Americans surround him on one side, and then the French fleet, which is conveniently wintering in this area, surrounds him on the other side and keeps him from being rescued by the British fleet.
And there actually is an important battle just ahead of this, which actually lets the French fleet in. And that's important because the French fleet is carrying a bunch of 25-pound siege cannons.
Ah, okay.
And the British don't have anything that big, which really allows the Americans to move in and destroy the various earthworks of the British, and really is the turning point in the war is having those cannons. And they have those cannons there.
Or recreations of them, I would assume.
Yes, actually one is a Spanish recreation of it, but it's a real... There are some original cannons inside in the museum portion, but out on the earthworks they also have recreations.
Mm-hmm. I'm just assuming the French took their cannons with them when they left. It'd be fairly valuable at those days.
Yeah.
And so this would be the final battle, so we're in 17...
It was 225 years ago, 1781.
1781, okay.
Yes, because it was October 1781.
Okay.
So I believe the end of the battle was October 19th.
Anything stand out for you about Yorktown?
The most amazing thing about Yorktown was we took a tour. There's a Battleworks tour. It's a half-hour tour. You don't go 200 feet. Incredibly short tour out on the Battleworks. We had the most passionate and interested guy leading this tour, and he was German. And I was just amazed at this German who knew every detail. He knew when troops moved by the hour, what happened at noon, what happened at 2, and all you had to do was act a little bit interested, and he would go on for 20 minutes. We also have him on our podcast, a little bit of him, but it was just amazing that this guy has come over from Germany to do this at Yorktown. Now, of course, the Germans were our allies in that battle also. Two different kinds of Germans, because we had Germany all split up into little...
Right, Germany's not a nation yet at that point.
Right, it's got another 100 years or so before it's even going to be considering becoming a nation.
Right.
90 years, but anyway.
Now, I think of Germans in the Revolutionary War. I think of, other than the drill sergeant at Valley Forge, I think of Hessians who were on the other side. So
yes,
you're actually catching me by surprise here.
Yeah, but there were Germans on the sides of the Americans.
Okay.
Probably fighting those other Germans.
Von
anyway.
Steuben, I think, is that the...
Yes, von Steuben, who's memorialized in Lafayette Square in front of the White House. He was at Yorktown.
And he's basically the German officer who came over from, I believe, from Prussia.
Yes.
But I wouldn't swear to it, and basically taught the Americans how to be an army.
That is exactly correct. And they were not very good at being an army, which actually takes us to the last of these 5 sites, which is the Yorktown Victory Center.
Okay.
That is a recreation of a couple of things. It's a fairly small site. Of the 5 of these sites, it was the smallest. It has a really great timeline. We did Jamestown first, and then Williamsburg, and then Yorktown over a 3-day weekend. And coming there was really good because this timeline put everything in order. Did you know that the first Tea Party was at Yorktown, not in Boston?
I did not.
Yes, it was. Now, the British reacted more to the one in Boston, but there was a Tea Party before that where they dumped tea into the water in Yorktown. But you learn little things like that. But they have a recreation of a camp. And one of the points you find out is that the British, being professional soldiers, were incredibly neat, and the Americans were just filthy and not very well behaved, and really didn't know how to be an army at that point. And you get some feel for that. Again, they were doing some foodways, so you got some feel for how they cooked, and I would rather eat in Williamsburg than in Yorktown. And they did an arms demonstration, which was really interesting there. We got there at the end of a day, so we kind of missed some of the stuff that would have happened earlier in the day, and we didn't get to go into the museum, and they have a large museum there. They also have a farm that is very much how people lived immediately after the Revolution. Immediately after the Revolution, America didn't instantly thrive, as I kind of think we're aware under the Articles of Confederation. And a lot of the people who were not rich ended up living on these very, very limited farms, and they have recreated one there. And that was very interesting and something I had not known of before. So that was a real revelation for me, because I think in terms, having come from Massachusetts, I think of terms of Boston and the city streets there, and Plymouth is very, it's a later Plymouth, the way they've done Plymouth Plantation. So
Sure.
it's very picturesque and interesting and stuff. But this was a struggle. This life was a struggle. These people did not have it easy. It was interesting. You're brought up in all of these against the institution of slavery.
Sure.
Which is something you'd not brought up against in Massachusetts, which was really, I don't know how to say, very moving, I think, to really come up against, because Virginia was the center of the slave trade during much of that time. There are slaves in Williamsburg, in Yorktown. When you're in the farm, you see where the slave, they only rent a slave. They can't afford a slave, so they rent them. Where he would have slept on a pallet in the barn. That was his entire place. And even in Jamestown, because Jamestown settlers very quickly brought Africans in to do the heavy work.
Any final comments for us about these 3 historic sites?
Well, I do have a great tip, and that is that if you're going, first of all, this is not a day trip. We did it in 3 days, and it was not enough time. I wish I had 4 or 5 days at least, or even a week. And maybe some year we'll go back for a week and really do this with a lot more leisure and not having to worry about sound levels and things like that. But there is something called the Historic Triangle Pass, which you can buy instead of individual tickets. And it gives you access to all 5 of these sites for only $62.50, which is about a $20 savings over the totals of all these tickets. And the individual tickets are only good for 1 day, and this pass is good for 5 days. So you have 5 days you can use this pass and go anywhere you want. You can return, and it really is very worthwhile if you're going to be going and doing this kind of thing. There's huge amounts of tourist infrastructure, particularly in Williamsburg, which is right in the middle. Whatever your favorite hotel is, there is one in Williamsburg. And there are budget hotels, and there are about 1 billion timeshares. If you have a timeshare, it's very easy to shake. We usually say at Shea Home, which is my husband's parents' house. So...
But you're not offering that, you're saying?
No, I don't think so.
Well, Julie, I thank you so much for coming back on the show. This is Julie's 3rd trip, as we said, and I've enjoyed all 3.
And so have I.
And thank you very much for being here.
Okay, thank you.
This show's already gone a little long, and so I don't think I'll do the Internet Resources section or the Community section this week. But feel free to give me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com, or give a comment at amateurtraveler.com, or check out the discussion boards. And I'm finishing up this show from Istanbul and hope to get this up before I get home. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
One more cathedral, I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, pod show, and limelight.